Monster Hunter's third generation was special. While still building on everything its predecessors had established, the personality and creativity poured into it made for a fresh and distinct experience. Beyond the monsters, the village, and the music, the most striking change was a twist on the combat system, the ability to move and fight underwater. Opening up the worlds beneath the waves introduced variety and possibilities never before seen, and at the time, represented the biggest change in the series' tried and true formula. Ask people what they think about it though, and you'll hear some mixed opinions. Some players absolutely loved it, and watch each new announcement trailer with fingers crossed, wishing for its return. Others absolutely hated it, with most pointing to the clunky controls as a key source of frustration. Those who look back on the mechanic unfavourably might point to the fact that it's been abandoned ever since the third generation as a means of validating their opinion. However, there's a weakness to that argument: the fact that underwater combat nearly made a return in Monster Hunter World. While ultimately abandoned due to time constraints, I think this proof of past intent means that underwater combat might return sooner than you think. Given the success of World, some kind of spiritual or stylistic sequel would be a no-brainer from a business perspective. That game would want to strike a balance between feeling familiar to World while still evolving and improving on its systems, and an easy way to do that would be to revisit an idea that was already intended to feature in the original. If that does happen, then I think it will receive a more positive reception thanks to the lessons learned from the mechanic's first outing. Because let's be clear, it was not perfect. Although I put some of the control issues down to the hardware of the Wii and the 3DS, fighting underwater has an undeniably rougher feeling than fighting on land. You move slower, evading is trickier, and most weapons have a restricted moveset. I'm sure a new iteration would attempt to alleviate or adjust these issues. If that happens, and people really like it, then Try's original version might be forever known as the shitty first attempt in all future discussion. In fact, I'd say it's already getting to that point before people have even seen any kind of updated take. There's a common sentiment that Try's version had potential and it just came too early in the series' lifetime, the implication being that it doesn't have merit beyond the simplest conceptual level. The crux of this video is that I don't think that's fair. I spent some time with Try and 3 Ultimate recently and was surprised at how much I enjoyed the experience of underwater combat. It's one partially created by my own feelings on recent Monster Hunter games, and because some other people probably feel the same way as I do, I figured now could be a good time to recommend you to revisit underwater combat too. If you've never played Try or 3 Ultimate, then you can still see if the experience I describe piques your interest. One thing I'd like to be clear about is that this video is by no means attempting to say that underwater combat is secretly great, because it has some big flaws. However, it is in part thanks to the somewhat more frustrating elements that I was able to have fun hunting underwater, so it's important to understand what the apparent problem really is. Monster Hunter is an action RPG with most of the fun coming from the combat system, which belongs to the left side of that hyphen. Being underwater slows you down and makes basic actions more difficult to perform, therefore limiting how much you can engage with the combat system, and therefore potentially limiting how fun the hunt is. In terms of player abilities, you lose access to the life-saving Superman jump, and your standard evades are slower with less invincibility frames. Depending on your weapon choice, your moveset might be reduced. For example, the sword and shield really suffers from this. These changes make the fight more difficult, but because that's achieved by removing or weakening your intrinsic abilities, rather than adjusting the exterior challenge created by the monster, it can feel unfair. And when difficulty feels unfair, people tend to feel unhappy. Although that's not to say that no element of challenge comes from the monsters themselves. More often than not, they'll become more powerful when fought underwater. Part of that is thanks to the mobility imbalance between you and them. While you struggle to move around, they can swim and dive quickly and smoothly all around the arena. Their other advantage is that being underwater usually grants them access to their most powerful moves. For example, Gobel can swim down to the riverbed and then explode vertically upwards, and the Gaiacrus can create a massive electrical field, moves that both monsters can't perform when on dry land. The extra difficulty created by all of this interferes with how you engage with the combat system, and if that's where a lot of the fun comes from, then it's logical that fighting underwater can cause frustration. But from this perspective, a lot of the game's other design choices start to look strange. If combat is the main goal, then why do you have to spend a few minutes running around an empty environment looking for your target? Why not have everything take place in an arena so the fight, and therefore the fun, can start right away? Or why have other monsters invade your quests? It's a great feeling when you get immersed into a flow state of combat between you and your adversary. So why have a gigantic pickle or a pinecone explode onto the scene and upend everything? The answer, of course, is that these design elements aren't there to support the action side of the game. They're there to support the RPG side. The game wants you to become at least partially immersed in the world, because when you are, the whole experience feels more engaging and interesting. The best way of illustrating how important these elements are is to imagine how you'd feel about playing a Monster Hunter game that was nothing but arena quests. I know that I would lose interest in something like that very fast. In fact, effort at believability and immersion underpin the entire combat system. This is supposed to be a world of danger, where human control ends at the edge of each small village or city. To reflect this, your attacks and movements are slower than those of other action games, and you're pitted against an enemy with high damage attacks and a large health pool. These two elements force you to play cautiously and actively think about each action you perform. This careful style of play makes you feel like you're actually engaging with a dangerous beast out in the wild, instead of just some enemy placed into the world to serve as a temporary roadblock. As you grow to understand the system and practice, however, the balance of power shifts to be more in your favour. Every Monster Hunter game is a good challenge, but the sense of danger diminishes as your time to finish each hunt gets shorter. If you end up farming one particular monster for a rare drop, you become so proficient that it's almost impossible to see them as a real threat anymore. And this is why Tri's underwater combat is so interesting to me. No matter how good you are at the game, its inherent difficulty will always force you to play more defensively, and so it can still generate an immersive experience even after all these years. Earlier, I said that the difficulty can be frustrating because it doesn't feel fair, but perhaps unintentionally, that's the very thing that allows it to consistently offer this solid experience regardless of skill level. Jumping into a murky riverbed to fight a giant crocodile serpent should feel tense, and thanks to the disempowerment of the player character, it does. Having your avatar weaken like this might not sound appealing at first, but if you enjoy genres like survival horror games, where it's also used to great effect, then you might be able to recognise that this can be a fun experience. A player who began with World or Rise might feel the clunkiness of old style games to generate this kind of feeling on land too, in which case I imagine the transition underwater might feel even more striking. It's just such a different experience to that offered by recent games. While I enjoyed my time with Rise, I found my most and least favourite aspect of the experience came from how powerful hunters are now. The wirebug moves and extra mobility further deepen the action system, and while it's fun to experiment and engage with them, they also make it hard to see monsters as real threats. Why would I need to plan my actions carefully when I can negate all damage and counter all the monster's attacks? In Rise, I often feel that I can mostly ignore what the monster is doing in favour of focusing on just pulling off my flashy combos and special moves. In previous games, I'd be punished for playing like that, but it works so well here that I sometimes wonder if it's the intended playstyle. Underwater combat contrasts with this style so significantly, a difference that I found made it all the more engaging. At the beginning of this video, I said if underwater combat returns, then I think most people will prefer it to the older version. And that's because I think a new iteration won't disempower the player as much as the original. It would be an understandable choice, because it's only with retrospect and distance that I've been able to truly understand and enjoy the experience. But, while it is far from perfect, there's a risk that attempting to fix all of the flaws might leave the new mechanic unable to provide these kinds of feelings. And I think that would be a shame. The flaws that partially made underwater combat so difficult were what enabled it to generate a true sense of disempowerment and fear, lending believability to a world that should feel dangerous. This is just one type of experience these games can offer, and as the series continues into the future, it's going to need to find ways of offering new and exciting takes on the formula to avoid stagnation. I'm looking forward to Sunbreak, but I can't see it offering any experiences that are significantly different to what's available in Rise. It is, of course, unfair to make that kind of judgment before it's even released, but it's that sense of creeping fatigue that put me in the right headspace to be able to look at underwater combat with fresh eyes. It's far from perfect, but that doesn't mean it's not interesting or that it can't be fun. So, if you're looking for a bit of variety in your Monster Hunter experience, then I'd recommend you go take a swim. Thank you for watching.